In 2004, Sheldon Menery wrote a blog post on Star City Games that introduced the world to Elder Dragon Highlander. He explained the rules of the format and also showcased his own Arcades Sabbath deck, the first EDH deck list. Menery described it as such. The idea behind the deck is to get huge fatties into play and start laying the beat down, gaining the odd bit of life and protecting myself early with multiple wrath effects. Then, after getting the big guns into play, it's all about control. You'll see there's a good deal of card drawing, and I frequently have to discard before passing the turn. He went on to highlight a few specific cards that turned out to be very powerful, like using Defense of the Heart to cheat out Darksteel Colossus and Bringer of the Blue Dawn, tapping Caracas to bounce opposing generals, and controlling the pace of the game with Mystic Snake. Conceptually, this deck isn't anything too wild, but the actual cards included in it make it fundamentally different from modern commander decks. Its average mana value is incredibly high. There are hardly any creatures in it that cost less than 5 mana. And just because the creatures are expensive, doesn't mean they are powerful. Sabertooth Nishoba is a 6 mana 5/5 with trample and protection from red and blue. And that's it. It's not a particularly impressive creature outside of very specific use cases. The same is true for a couple more cards in the deck. Hydroblast, Crusading Knight, and Akroma, Angel of Wrath, are each color-specific hosers, and Hurricane requires our opponents to play at least some quantity of flying creatures to be worth using. As Menery explained, one of the core strategies of this deck is to use cards like Defense of the Heart, Thicket Elemental, and Tooth and Nail to cheat out enormously high-cost creatures. But even those cards are high on mana cost, and the deck hardly plays any ramp. It simply needs to play lands until it hits the necessary mana values. There are also a variety of graveyard synergies, but no ways to fill up the yard. I'm not exaggerating when I say that I don't think I've ever seen a deck quite like it before. Magic is an old game. EDH hasn't been around for quite as long, but it still long predates me playing it. So much of its history happened before I had a chance to experience it, and the stories about the old days always enthrall me. But our brains are terrible. Recollections from that long ago are often faulty, if not outright fabrications. Not malicious ones, mind you, just small adjustments that we made unconsciously over long periods of time until the truth got lost in them. The way I look at it is that the only way I can properly learn about EDH's past is to experience it myself. So I did the only rational thing. I found the oldest EDH deck lists available, and then went to a coffee shop, printed them all out, made a ton of proxies, assembled the decks, and then went out and tortured people with them. I started with Menery's 2004 Arcades Sabbath deck, which we just read the description of. While playing it, I tried to stick as closely to the old EDH rules as possible, meaning I played without a command zone and instead shuffled my commander into my deck at the beginning of the game. Since the decklist included the banned Caracas, and I didn't want to torture the other players at the table too much, I also applied the errata that was made to that card a few years later, which prohibited it from being activated on commanders. If you'd like a more detailed look at the development history of Commander, then please check out this video, which is fully dedicated to that subject matter, and if you're enjoying this video so far, please give it a thumbs up. Now please understand that nothing I say today is meant with any malicious intent. I don't mean to be disrespectful. Players at the time had a much smaller and less powerful card pool, as well as less experience with the format, and we are all aware of that and are going to keep it in mind. But I'm still going to talk from a modern perspective. Menery's Arcades Sabbath deck was unfortunately a bit unplayable. The deck just doesn't have any ramp aside from 5 mana rocks. Now, I don't subscribe to the idea that ramp is 100% necessary in Commander, though to the ground creature decks can do just fine without it, but the majority of the creatures in this deck cost 5 mana or more. I would usually spend most of the early game just playing a land and passing. And that's assuming I actually drew enough lands because the deck only plays 37 of them. For most decks, I would say that 37 lands is a fine number. But we need so much mana here, despite having very limited ramp, that missing a land drop might as well be GG. However, Menary said that the deck also has a lot of card draw, which should allow us to guarantee those land drops. But it just doesn't. Even in my most generous interpretation possible, the deck only plays 12 pieces of card draw. But then I'm counting Decree of Justice and Eternal Dragon as card draw. And let's be honest with ourselves, they aren't. Temporal Aperture, Whispers of the Muse, and Staff of Domination are also stretching the definition quite a bit. Compost and Coastal Piracy can be very good, but Compost requires our opponents to play black, and I didn't have much luck with that. And Coastal Piracy requires creatures on the board, which takes us forever because we don't play any ramp and everything is so prohibitively expensive. Really, the only cards I would consider proper card draw are Ophidian and Bringer of the Blue Dawn, both of which are still way too expensive for the effect they provide. However, credit where credit is due. In one match, I did actually manage to cheat out Bringer of the Blue Dawn with Defense of the Heart on turn 5, and afterwards, I actually had access to a lot of cards, and I also got myself Necroma, Angel of Wrath into play as a bit of a defensive line. From there, I managed to hit all of my land drops and actually played a creature on every single turn, even kicking a Thicket Elemental to bring out a Platinum Angel. And this is where I want to praise this deck. In the one game where I got to do what it was built for, I had a lot of fun. Every turn I played an incredibly expensive creature that sure looked intimidating. I also got to use Helm of Obedience to steal a Clockwork Hydra from another player for only the small cost of 9 mana. Copy Artifact on Darksteel Colossus was also hilarious, especially after I waited 11 turns to hardcast the Darksteel Colossus. I managed to succeed in that game because of the deck's pretty decent removal suite. It plays 3 Baths, which are just good. Swords and Aura Shards are also very effective, and in the right circumstances, even Hydroblast and Hurricane can do okay. An absolute standout for me though was Desert Twister, a 2-mana green sorcery that destroys any permanent in play. How have I never heard of this card before? I mean, sure, it's a sorcery and 2 green pips makes things a bit more tricky, but the effect is very strong and mana efficient. Wait a second. Let me take a closer look. Closer. Closer. What? It's 6 mana? Why would they print it like this? It's unreadable. Alright, never mind. It's trash. This seems like a good point to mention that when playing these decks, I use the original versions of all the cards, which occasionally made for a fantastically unhinged experience of trying to figure out how they actually work. If there's any takeaway from this video, it is that you should go and print old cards and play with them, because they're really funny and just completely incomprehensible. Returning to our Arcades Sabbath deck, you may have noticed that I've not mentioned our general at all. This deck plays both tutors and mana cheating effects to get creatures out of the deck. And unfortunately, at no point during any of my games did I ever feel like I should be searching out Arcades. The card is just so bad, and I didn't want to kneecap myself for the meme because I felt like then I wouldn't be giving the deck a fair shot. But I'm not confident this was the right call. Playing this deck 100% felt like I was just playing with a pile of Menary's favorite cards. It's clear that the goal of this deck wasn't to be strong, it was to be cool. And assuming that it was played in an environment of similar decks, I can see how that would mitigate the frustrations I had with it. Going land pass for 6 turns is probably totally fine if everybody at the table does it. That way it takes 5 minutes and then the actual game begins. Cards like Helm of Obedience were also likely to be much better in an environment where everybody had decks full of enormous high mana cost creatures. But in most of my games, I just kind of sat there and watched while my opponents played. The main problem was really that even if I cast a board wipe, my follow-up was a 6 mana 5/5 with trample, while my opponents rebuilt an engine. And that's the crux of the difference between this deck and even just a modern precon. Commander decks today try to build momentum, while this old one was content with just playing a creature. The only thing in it that could in any way count as an engine is its graveyard recursion. But the deck has no way of actually getting things into the graveyard. It just waits for them to die, and then it doesn't reanimate most of the time and instead returns those huge creatures to our hand so they can be cast again. Ultimately, the deck has a sort of playground feel to it. I cast my big guy, and then it's your turn to cast your big guy, and then we'll see which guy is bigger. The most pure-hearted kind of battlecruiser magic. And while that doesn't really work in modern Commander anymore, it was really charming and good fun. Also in 2004, in the same blog post where Menery showcased his Arcades Sabbath deck, he started a deck building contest awarding $25 of Star City credit to the person who comes up with the coolest deck in this format, as judged by me, using Lord of Tresserhorn as the general. Not only must the deck use Tresserhorn's 3 colors, but it must be designed to turn his drawbacks into advantages. A week later then, Menery showcased the best decks that were submitted and crowned the winner, Nathan Long. He specifically highlighted the inclusion of Hivis of the Scale as the reason why this deck won the contest. Long then described the deck as one that primarily revolved around the graveyard and reanimation. It also put an emphasis on bouncing and stealing creatures, stealing in particular having nice synergy with the Lord of Tresserhorn. Lord of Tresserhorn is a 4-mana Grixis creature with a huge 10-4 stat line and the ability to regenerate for only a single black mana. However, when the Lord of Tresserhorn enters the battlefield, his controller has to pay 2 life, sacrifice 2 creatures, and choose an opponent to draw 2 cards. This of course means that unless we already control 2 other creatures, we would be forced to sacrifice the Lord of Tresserhorn when he enters. The deck then plays a large number of tutors, both into hand and into the graveyard, as well as a solid reanimation and ramp suite. These sections are genuinely well put together, in ways that make sense. Much of the ramp comes from creatures like Mirrors and Familiars, which can then be sacked for the Lord of Tresserhorn, who we can tutor up quite easily. The rest of the deck is a small set of additional sacrifice targets, a tiny bit of card draw, a few additional reanimation targets, and finally, a huge amount of removal. About a fifth of the deck is removal, although the quality of it varies a lot, starting with Gorilla Shaman and Morg Fanatic, working its way through Prophetic Bolt and Shard Phoenix, and ending at Decree of Pain and Living Death. The goal of the deck is very simple. Stick Lord of Tresserhorn, spam removal spells to get blockers out of the way, regenerate the Lord over and over again, and then slowly but surely beat our opponents to death with 10 damage attacks. It's not a bad strategy, but the specifics are not ideal. The biggest problem with the deck is that it just doesn't play any card draw. In one game, I managed to set up a loop with Hapless Researcher and Lifeline, which allowed me to sacrifice the Researcher on every player's turn to loot, which was certainly cool, but also not actually card draw. The best card draw effect in the deck is Decree of Pain, which is a very powerful card that I like to play in my decks as well. But it has one small problem. I'll give you a moment to see if you can spot it. Since Commander is an eternal format, we get to play with a lot of old cards, cards that often have effects that aren't necessarily applicable to the modern game anymore because they reference old, retired mechanics. Mechanics like Regenerate. Regenerate allows a creature to survive once when it would be destroyed. It's of course a bit more complicated than that, but for our purposes that's all we need to know. Regenerate is a problematic mechanic because it prevents the game from progressing. If all players control regenerate creatures, they'll never be able to actually hit each other. Removal spells don't help much either, as regenerate can even undo those. It's a mechanic that required constant consideration from the design team, and so many old removal spells, like for example Wrath of God, read, destroy all creatures, they can't be regenerated. This can't be regenerated clause was later turned into bury, which was eventually turned back into can't be regenerated. Regenerate causes issues that are best fixed by cards that fully prevent it, making the whole mechanic a little bit pointless. And that of course brings us back to Decree of Pain. Destroy all creatures, they can't be regenerated. Unlike Menary's deck, this list is fully designed around Lord of Tresserhorn. It doesn't play any other ways to close out the game. Because of that, and considering how difficult he is to actually bring into play, we really need the Lord of Tresserhorn to stick. But he dies like any other creature if we cast Decree of Pain, and similarly his protection doesn't work against Living Death either. Of course, we just don't cast them while the Lord is out, but that limits two of the strongest cards in our deck. And also, I feel like that's the whole point of the Lord of Tresserhorn, that you can have him in play and then play a board vibe, but not have him be destroyed by it. And of course, there's also the problem that our opponents can just play their own removal spells that bypass regenerate. There are so many cards that do that. Swords to Plowshares, Pongify, Terminate, Damnation, Wrath of God, Farewell, Cyclonic Rift, Chaos Warp, and I could keep going forever. In a lot of scenarios, Regenerate does literally nothing, as it was designed out of the game. But when our opponents don't have something that bypasses Regenerate, it becomes so broken. We can just attack freely with our Lord of Tresserhorn, and there's nothing our opponents can do about it. 10 damage is a huge amount. No creature will survive combat, and player damage adds up incredibly quickly. If all our opponents can do is destroy the Lord, then he is a monster. It was an incredibly polarizing experience. Either I couldn't do anything, or I just murdered people. My biggest takeaway from playing this deck is that Regenerate is a terrible mechanic, and it was rightfully retired. However, that doesn't mean it wasn't fun to play when it worked. To put it simply, the Lord of Tresserhorn just kicks ass. I thoroughly enjoy how much work is needed to bring him into play, and how unkillable he could become in the right circumstances, and how we could abuse those circumstances. Crater Helion is a 6-mana 6/6 with Echo that deals 4 damage to everything on ETB. Reanimating Crater Helion every single turn with Lifeline locked my opponents out of the game completely, which only required mild cheating, because it turns out that Lifeline was actually errata in 2004, and it lets everybody reanimate, not just me. But I didn't know that in the moment, and neither did anybody else at the table, so we just played the card as it was written. Don't worry, the same play would have been possible with the, at the time, not banned, recurring Nightmare in our deck. Overall, I was quite impressed with the power level of this deck. While it still felt like I was playing slower than the modern lists, the difference was 2 turns instead of 5, and I had enough interaction to keep my opponents wary. And while the deck didn't play anywhere near enough card draw, it had the tutors I needed to find Decree of Pain to rebuild my hand in the late game. While Menary's Arcady Sabbath deck felt like I was playing a relic of the past, Long's Lord of Tresserhorn list made me immediately want to deck build and improve upon it. Yes, it's outdated, but there was a solid plan here that worked occasionally. But at the same time, a lot of that came from the abundance of tutors in the deck, which is something that I don't personally enjoy. I find generic tutors to be time-consuming, uninteresting, and going against the spirit of a singleton format. However, I can see why they might have been required back in the day. Without tutors, we might never get to see our general, and the overall card quality was just so low that skipping past a good bunch of them felt necessary. That really was what stood out the most to me. Today, I can easily build decks with 100% good and thematic cards, but these old lists played a bunch of cards that felt like they were only included because they had to somehow hit that 100 card threshold. I've always been told about the golden age of EDH, when everybody just played their favorite cards, when power creep hadn't been invented yet, and when things were truly casual. And now that I've played these two decks, I can say that yeah, things were actually different. In particular, if your EDH experience was centered around Menaries. His Arcades Sabbath deck was so slow that it simply couldn't function in a modern environment. Allow me to go on a small detour. I've always wondered why Sol Ring is the icon of EDH. From my experience, anytime somebody plays a Sol Ring, the game becomes less fun because of it. My goal in Commander is always to play a game together, ideally an evenly matched one. But an early Sol Ring often ruins that experience by having a player get an overwhelming advantage that either lets them run away with the match, or they get ganged up on and aren't allowed to play anymore. I don't enjoy that, even if I'm the one benefiting. Sol Ring is a fast mana, it's banned in Legacy, it's the strongest card in Commander, but for some reason it's also the one card that's exempted from power level discussions. None of this has ever made sense to me, and I don't play Sol Ring in any of my decks for that reason. But now that I've spent quite a lot of time with these ancient EDH decks, I can understand it a bit better. These decks all played a lot of tutors, because they had to. How else would they ever find their general? And since their deck already played some tutors, they might as well double down on them and make sure they can always find their Sol Ring. This then let them bypass their sluggish early game that stemmed from the much lower card quality they had back in the day. I can now appreciate why Sol Ring made sense, because everybody had one in play and it made it so you could skip past the early game. Although I still don't think it has any place in modern Commander decks, but that's a story for a different time. To get back to Arcades, I think the main lesson I learned from this deck is to appreciate the beauty of just slamming a big guy into play. Reject strategy and embrace playing Serra Avatar. I usually build my decks to have very efficient cost-effect ratios, but now I've been finding myself spending more time looking at big flashy cards that might be less sensible but are just cool. It's supposed to be a game made up of cards we enjoy. Maybe a few less vegetables are in order. But this deck pretty much exactly met my expectations. The Lord of Tresserhorn list well surpassed them. It's just a pretty decently built deck with a solid strategy. There was clearly a lot of thought put into it, and it wouldn't take many adjustments to turn it into a deck that would perform totally fine in today's environment. The main problems it suffers from are card quality and a lack of card draw. If more decks were built like this one, then old EDH wasn't actually all that different from today. To test this hypothesis, I actually put together a third deck as well. A Kiyomaro First to Stand deck, posted in 2007 by Benny Smith, one of the first outside advocates for EDH. It's a Voltronish and life-gainish list that's not all that different from what I would expect to see today. Again, held back by card quality, but all of our modern concepts are there. Power creep is definitely a real factor, but aside from that, I don't think EDH changed all that much. The player mentality seems to be about the same, it's just that the rest of Magic isn't. But the great thing here is that the old Magic isn't gone. We can still go back and play it. I come from Dota 2, and the Dota of today is unrecognizable from the Dota of 10 years ago. They are two different games, and I always think that's a little sad, not because I dislike the modern game, but because the old game is gone. It can't be played anymore. It's been overwritten by a decade of patches. And so something I find really wonderful about Magic and games like it is that if I want to experience old cards and play old decks, I can. It's as simple as finding a deck list, sleeving it up, and taking it to game night. And that's just beautiful. Thank you very much for watching the video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. I have to say, this was a very interesting experience, but I don't know if I would recommend it because these decks are just a tad little bit clunky. Although, I don't know, I like the Lord of Tresserhorn. I do kind of want to build a Lord of Tresserhorn deck. To be honest, this is actually just a neat little card. I think he's just cool. I actually don't have anything in Grixis colors, so maybe. If you want to try the decks yourself, down in the description, I've put the deck lists. Although I had to do some guessing if it came to the land base, because the deck lists back then didn't include lands. So I just put something together that made sense to me. Yeah, just kind of keep that in mind. And also, check the prices while you're at it. I just think it's funny that this Lord of Tresserhorn deck is, I think, 28,000 euros. With all the alpha lands. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed it, enjoyed the video, and I'll see you guys soon.